Tēnā koutou katoa, nau mai, haere mai ki te kōrero COP26. So welcome to this discussion panel on gender, science, Indigenous thinking and climate change. Ko rangi niui ki runga, ko papatuanu ki raro, tihei Maori ora. I'll acknowledge the Sky Father and the Earth Mother, and because we're discussing the taniwha of climate change, I'd also like to acknowledge Tāne Mahuta, Tangaroa and Tāwhiri Mātia. E mihi ana ki ngā iwi o Waikato Tainui ngā iwi manaki i ahau, I tipu aki au, I te ko awa awa o manga aotaki, tēnei hinehi nui, mania poto rohi, no tāwahi o ko tūpuna. Ko au te amu kapu o te aka mātuatua ki te whariwānanga o Waikato. Ko Margaret tōku ingoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. So my name is Margaret Barber. I'm the Dean of Te Aka Mātuatua, the School of Science at the University of Waikato. So in this discussion panel, as part of our series on COP26, we'll cover the intersection of climate change with gender, science and Indigenous thinking. So as you just heard, I'm a Pākehā and I'm trained in Western science, which means I'm not at all qualified to cover many aspects of the topics we'll cover today, but I have a wonderful panel with me and they are experts in various aspects of what we'll discuss, and I'm not going to take up too much of your time. I'd like to hand over to them shortly, but I would like to just start by framing our discussion today. I would say to start with that climate change is the most pressing issue around environment for humanity at the moment. Humans have altered the biochemical cycles on Earth to a point that we're actually now in a new geological age, the Anthropocene. And so we really can't ignore this anymore, and COP26 is our hope for fixing the problem. The science of climate change has actually been well covered and it's completely agreed upon. The latest IPCC scientific report makes it very clear that climate is changing, that humans are responsible for it, and that we're running out of time. We need to act now. And we need to act in ways that are kind of encapsulated by that funny little series of words that Boris Johnson came up with: coal, cars, cash, and trees. And so scientists have been saying things about the coal part, the cars part, and the trees part for quite some time, but they've never had the cash part. And that cash part is really, really important to help developing countries who aren't responsible for climate change and who are most strongly affected by climate change to actually transition to the new way of living and working that we need to deal with climate change. So as an academic trained in Western science, I'm deeply embedded in that Western philosophy, which assumes human exceptionalism. And this isn't a philosophy that's shared by everyone around the world. But having trained in that discipline, it's really difficult for a Western trained scientist to recognize the culture of science and how the culture of science has actually contributed to aspects of climate change itself in terms of progress and industrialization. So I think we need to shift our way of thinking, and we need to shift it towards kaitiakitanga. We need, as scientists and as global citizens, we need to think about different worldviews that challenge this thought of humans being above nature and rather humans being part of nature, and humans approaching other species, but also the land and the water and the air with respect. And I see that's the way I interpret kaitiakitanga, as stewardship and respect towards other parts of our world. This is really, it's actually present, not in those words of course, but it is present in the Paris Agreement in Article 7, Section 5, when it talks about adaptation to climate change, engaging with Indigenous knowledge, engaging with Indigenous peoples and their knowledge of their local systems to create new futures that engage with respect. So this is what we're going to talk about today. I would just finish on one interesting thing that I've thought about quite a bit lately, and that is how we've colonised the atmosphere. And so Indigenous scholars like Holly Jean Buck and Kunai Helu Tharman have written about how the Western world has colonised the atmosphere, and they've sort of divided it up and privatised it and commoditised it and put it on a market, a shared market, in a way that is quite, well, colonial for a start, but also not with respect, not with kaitiaki. And so this is what I see as the heart of the climate emergency. And if we were rather thinking he auranga taiao, he auranga tangata, that is the well-being of the people depends on the well-being of the environment, we wouldn't be in a climate emergency. So I'd like to just stop talking there and hand over to Hamish. He'll introduce himself and then share his views on this issue. So Hamish.
Thank you, Margaret. Ngā mihi nui ki koutou katoa. Kina tangata whenua Waikato tainui tēnā koutou. Kina tangata whenua katoa o te motu tēnā koutou. Kina tangata te hunei haere mai. Ko Ruapehu toko maunga, ko Wangane te awa tupua toko awa, ko Hamish McDowell toko ingoa, ko te koramata o te rohi o Wanganui toko mahi. I'm Hamish McDowell, I'm the Mayor of Wanganui and the Vice President of Local Government New Zealand. I'm similarly conscious that I'm a Pākehā male, and as such talking about gender and Indigenous thinking might seem a little perverse. But what I will say, to quote the late great scientist Carl Sagan, science is a way of thinking much more than a body of knowledge, and in many ways needs to exist alongside the lived experience of generations, that is Indigenous thinking, and in Aotearoa's case, Mataranga Maori. When I'm not a mayor, I'm a writer, and I studied literature rather than science at university, and it taught me that parallel systems lead to important truths. It's similar to a history of a major event living alongside the fiction that is written around the historical events. There's a truth about the lives of ordinary people that novels and stories and poems at that time reflect that are absent from the well-researched histories. You can't simply prefer the research history because of the method of research to tell the full story. You have to listen to the other voices to get the full picture. I want to speak briefly about my experience in local government of working alongside and with Mataranga Maori. You might think from the sturm and drang around the three waters that local government's a conservative sector unwilling to look at new ways of doing things, but I reject that. For the most part, the local government sector can be nimble, progressive, and intimately connected to the communities we represent. And the tangata whenua of our individual rohi key partners. They're geographically defined, so are the councils. I look at Whanganui, where Te Awa Tupua, the Wanganui River, has a special legislated status. And that status is actually being broadcast to the world at the moment as a feature of the New Zealand Pavilion and the other big global event, which is Expo 2020. The kawa that are embodied in the Te Awa Tupua legislation are important, and I just want to take time to read them out. The first kawa, ko te awa te matapuna o te ora. And this is where climate change is folded into the legislation. Our awa and environment sustains us with life and natural resources, and these must be protected from the impacts of climate change so that current and future generations may be nourished. That's a statute. The kawa turua, erere ko mai I te awa nui mai I te kahui maunga ki Tangaroa. So our awa and environments, including physical and spiritual elements, are indivisible, and climate change responses must be cognizant of the holistic impact on all realms of well-being. ko te awa, ko au, that's Whanganui famous saying, there is an inalienable connection between people, the awa, and the environment, and we have a responsibility to change the way we live to reinforce and strengthen this connection. And the final kawa, na maunga iti, na maunga nui, I hono ko ana ka tupa he awa. So coordinated effort on climate change is required across all communities and authorities, given that our awa and environments are integral to our worldview and lives. So they're the interpretations of the kawa. Now, how does that work in reality? And I'll give the example of the port development that's currently occurring. We're rejuvenating the old port, and we're trying to embody the kawa in this development. There's no sense in rejuvenating port infrastructure, but derogating the environment with it. So we are operating with an abundance model, which needs not to be only economic, but also social, and most importantly, environmental. We have a co-governance model, Te Pua, where Hapuan and community representatives sit alongside Horizons and the Whanganui District Council, and we demand that in the development, care is taken not to further degrade the river, indeed to reverse some of the effects of past development. It's a new way of working. And there are some skeptics, but once you explain to the skeptics that you're seeking to enhance the river, people start to get it. In terms of Mataranga Maori, and I'll shift to resilience, the 2015 floods in Whanganui taught us that the civil defence response needs to be both general and specific to tangata whenua. And so in 2017, we modelled, when we had a threatened flood, we modelled a very successful parallel emergency operating centre. And I want to acknowledge here Horizons Regional Council, because in February this year, Horizons Joint Committee on Climate Change was formed and is intending to model true co-governance. The committee is made up of the mayors of the Manawatu Whanganui area and the representatives of the iwi of the Horizons region as well. So these are exciting moves. I could go on for a lot longer, but I do want to acknowledge one of the delights of the COP26 is the presence of Indigenous leaders pushing for land tenure rights as climate solutions, pushing for the stories to be heard. And I want to cite India Logan Riley from Ngāti Kahungunu, who said just yesterday or the day before, this is an invitation to you, talking to the leaders of the world. This is an invitation to you. Learn our histories, listen to our stories, honour our knowledge, and get in line or get out of the way. Tautoko. So I'll pass on to Kipper. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hamish. That was a really good segue into what I'm going to discuss. Really interesting. Ai. Mai te whai ao ki te ao marama, tihei Maori ora. Nei rau wā ku mihi ki a koutou i ngā taringa are o tēnei kōrero. Maori ora ki a koutou katoa. He uri no te hikapui o te arawa. Ko Ngāti piki ao te iwi, ko Ngāti te rangunora e mihi atu, e karanga atu ki a koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I am Dr. Kipper Morgan and the creator of the Maori Model Decision-Making Framework. Maori is the life-supporting capacity. Maori binds the physical to everything else that supports life, and it enables everything in the universe to exist. My message is this: Mōhiotanga a iwi, or Indigenous knowledge, has a unique contribution to make regarding climate change response. Climate change is one of the critical challenges to our future survival. Climate change is not being experienced by all peoples in a uniform way. The declining mode of our ecosystems and the inappropriateness of practices such as municipal waste creation, industrialization, agricultural intensification, and consumerism have been evident to the Maori peoples since before the first Waitangi tribunal cases in the late 1970s. Of particular interest to Maori is the Mauri of fresh water, and Hamish has already briefed us on that. Te Mauri o te Wai continues to be a primary concern for Maori peoples today. Changes in New Zealand policy and law mean that Indigenous ways of knowing must now be included in decision-making about fresh water. More compelling Indigenous ways of understanding and communicating impacts are required. The way our ancestors understood our purpose for existence is needed. Holistic understandings of climate change and solutions that will reverse the declining mode of our ecosystems of origin are needed. The understanding of science through an Indigenous lens is needed to facilitate a better future for all New Zealanders and the world. The Maori Model decision-making framework was created with the intention of assisting with this. The contribution of mōhiotanga iwi is important because science in the form it is currently communicated does not have the answers that humanity needs. Science has provided advances in many areas, but it has also facilitated many of the problems now facing humankind. I do not believe that science was blind to the potential negative outcomes of its practice, but rather that the lens through which the science is viewed and practiced is flawed. Indigenous knowledge provides a way of knowing and seeing that is unlikely to prioritise economic outcomes and reputation more highly than the inequitable outcomes and harm that arise. Reputation more highly than the inequitable outcomes and harm that arise as the result of poor choices. Indigenous peoples have learnt to coexist with their ecosystems of origin long before the European expansion and its allied process of colonisation arrived in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Indigenous peoples have values and beliefs aligned not just to perpetuating their own survival, but also aligned towards systems of abundance and mutual benefit. In a world being cannibalised by corporate greed and consumerism, the results are wars, ecosystem depletion, pollution, extinction, scarcity, disease, famine, wealth accumulation beyond belief, and climate change. The current global pandemic might have offered a chance to reset and rework this collectively, but trade deals seem to be just as important for some countries at this time. It is the quality of perspective offered by an Indigenous lens that is critically needed. Concepts of kotahitanga, haputanga, manakitanga, whakatipuranga, kaitiakitanga, whairawa, aroha, whanaungatanga, maramatanga, orangatanga. These are what are needed. So my question is this: would our tupuna, our Indigenous ancestors, have responded to climate change in the same way that the world is today? I do not think so. The global pandemic has slowed globalization in the global economy, but why expend so much effort trying to return it to what it was? Could the reason be that the decision makers are those that have and will continue to benefit most from the status quo? What is needed is decision-making based on Indigenous epistemologies and actions aligned to the way our tupuna did things, Māori-based ways of knowing, being, and are the answer. Tutua mai te whiwhia, mai te rawea. Bind all in the world of light to everything else. Nō reira, ka hikaia te ahi o mai. No te mea, ko tātou tūpuna i ngā wā mua, ngā hunga tiaki mo wēnei momo mōhiotanga. Nei rā ku mihi ki a rātou kua whiturangi hia. O tira, tātou ngā kanohi ora, Maori ora, koutou katoa. Tēnā koutou, thank you. I'm now going to pass to Lorraine. Kia ora, Lorraine.
Kia ora, Kipper. Mō tō kōrero. Ko te atua, te kaihanga o te korowai o te rangi Māori e, te korowai o te whakapapa. Kua horaina mai I runga I a tātou, nānau nei ngā mea katoa. Ka mihi ki kiingi tu heitia pōtatau te wherewhere o te tuawhitu, me tōnā whānau, me te wharue, kahui ariki, pai mārire. Ka titiro ake ahau ki te tihi o tōku maunga tapu, kei ko rā te rārangi kingi me te ātairangi kahu e takoto ana ko taupiri I tēnā. Ka huri ahau ki te wai o Waikato e tere nei, e ko pikipiko ana ki tōku marae, ka mihi ki ngā tīwhāwhākia. Kia rua tia tōku whare tūpuna, ana ko kai tumu kei rākau manga. E mihi Aroha ki te Waikato COP26, mō tō whakako, tēnā koutou. Kia ora, my name is Lorraine Dixon and I currently hold the climate change portfolio for Waikato Tainui. So when I was thinking about this session today, I thought I would start talking about my tūpuna as they grew up as kids and they probably knew the best shortcuts to their river, to their moana, to meet whanaunga from another hapu. And during these journeys, they probably knew which tree to harvest the best kawakawa leaves or the best creek to harvest fish, or how the sky and the warmth of the sun should look and feel like just before the sun sets or when it is going to rain. Their taiao was their playground as children, and they knew how to navigate it to get the best out of it, and it was safe. Imagine a way of knowing your taiao where one draws not just on years on a single place, but on generations of knowledge over centuries and some other Indigenous, even thousands of years. One where taiao is a thing not to be conquered, but a relationship and a connection to be nurtured and to be in sync with our taiao. I remember a kōrero from one of our late kaumātua from Rāhui Pōkeka, who when he was a child often knew where people came from the sweet scent oozing from our people's skin. He actually mastered it, as that smell often gave away the waters where they bathed. Oh, you're from Whangapai. Oh, you're from Rotoiti. You're from Kimihia. But as he grew older, the waters started to change and he couldn't get that scent anymore that recognised where people came from. So Mataranga has a woman's point and a male's point, as there are different traditional tasks that our people, but as our people and both of them do. A woman who's a weaver, for an example, demonstrates generational mātauranga through weaving and putting her innovation into the mix, which then also gets passed down to her next generation. And as a male who chooses a particular rākau to undertake carving, all possess different types of mātauranga, which can provide glimpses and hints into the state of our taiao before it's even visibly seen. That's the kind of knowledge that exists in Māori communities, and our way of knowing might help us to adapt on the way we treat the place that actually feeds and nurture us, which then we can move towards the journey of adapting to climate change. We have a relationship with our taiao that transcends what we see and feel and is governed by a system of our values and principles that set out how we interact with our taiao around us. Even Maori place names, lakes, creeks, also provide the insights of the quality of place and how that place was used. So our 33 hapu within Waikato Tainui used knowledge passed down through generations to observe the stars, the shapes of clouds, the behaviour of our taonga, to forecast the weather and to navigate the seas to meet whanaunga within the Pacific and beyond. But today our hapu can't rely on these forecasts because the weather varies more than ever before. So signs that used to foretell us to harvest our kai has been based on certain tree blooming or the flying of manu from west to east, east to west. And there are many more signs that we use, but it's been out of whack for a while. Our marae have witnessed environmental changes like these for a long time, but our observations have often been dismissed or ignored by Western science. It's interesting to let you know that Indigenous people comprise only 5% of the world's population, yet their lands encompass 22% of its surface, and 80% of the planet's biodiversity is on the lands where they lived. Call it coincidental, but it's a significant part of traditional Indigenous identity is linked to the natural world. Looking to Aotearoa, where once this nation was described God's best kept secret garden before Raupatu, it has now been mowed over, covered in concrete, with soils drying up, prone to exotic weeds, and that's all in God's garden. And the garden has a stench smell. We had to fight through councils and court to be heard, and finally, in 1991, the RMA actually acknowledged Maori to participate. We submit our cultural impacts assessments with our mātauranga as evidence, with good intentions that our mātauranga was not to be disseminated elsewhere. However, we have been told that consultancy agencies and firms hold cultural impacts assessments as records, and it is archived without us knowing. It is believed that disseminating these traditions can help to address challenges, but for us as Māori have no guarantee to our cultural values, our knowledge and our traditions to be respected. That potential pitfall is prompting us to question whether there is a way to share mātauranga that benefits our taiao as well as our iwi, our hapu and our marae. I find it to be both risky as well as an opportunity for our people. Our kaumātua feel that they like to see their mātauranga to help our taiao heal, but our mātauranga to be employed in the right way. Even when the government taps into our mātauranga for input, many of the resulting collaborations don't show respect for the people or the accumulated knowledge that our people possess, and is often misinterpreted to suit their needs. We know our playground, our waterways, our mātauranga is based on the longest generational observation of our taiao in Aotearoa versus N=5 scientific observations. We observed these places for generations. We know what makes our place tick, and we also know when our place is becoming sick. We also know what needs to be done, but the Western colonial world is not going to like it. Steering into the conversation of COP26, it'll be interesting to see if there's any concrete outcome from COP26 beyond lip service to Indigenous peoples and their rights. We also debate whether or not to go to the annual COP meetings. From a cost-benefit perspective, it may not be worth it for Indigenous leaders to spend limited funds and to take 2 weeks away from essential services that our iwi are facing today. It's trying times for us with COVID and combating climate change that requires our utmost attention. And even in the best times, access to participation in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change spaces is far from equal, whether the negotiators or for civil society observers. So global inequalities plays out in terms of whose delegation is biggest, best resourced and most able to cover multiple negotiations at the same, and marginalised groups and Indigenous people and women face particular barriers to participate. The gap in COP26 today is there isn't a session on climate change and health. This is a crucial session to be had. It would actually show tipping points that have already been tipped, usually amongst vulnerable people who are predominantly Indigenous people. There are lessons to be learnt in this space and also a wake-up call to the next COP that tipping points may not necessarily occur in the Western world. Kia ora, and I'll pass it over to Joe.
Kia ora tātou. I just want to just talk all the previous speakers. I'm just going to have to find some time to sit with that. No, England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Cornwall, Spain, Iberia and France, ona papakainga tōku tīpuna. No tani atua me o whakatoro ahau. Kei mōrena whire e noho ana, ko Ngāti Haua te kaitiaki o te rohi. No tangata tiriti au, ko Joe Wrigley taku ingoa. I am a Pākehā queer person and I lead the team at Waikato Environment Centre, which is also known as Go Eco. Our projects cover kai, transport, biodiversity and enterprise, and all of these things intersect with climate change and te tiriti o Waitangi. I just want to acknowledge that the lens that I am speaking through today is one of tangata tiriti, and that we need to not so much understand Mataranga Maori in the first instance as Pākehā and Tauiwi, rather we first need to understand our history and the why of the powers that brought us here in the first place and how we came to be here. We support hapu to realise kaitiakitanga in their rohi. As tangata tiriti, we consider it our responsibility to investigate and understand the impacts and systems of power, including both capitalism and colonisation on our environment. Identifying as a tangata tiriti organisation is our acknowledgement that we were created as a settler organisation and operate within systems of imperial and colonial power. Every element of this conversation is uncomfortable for us. It challenges our white settler version of history, our class version of power, and it moves our belief that possession and possessing more is how we value and place people in a class or as a subcategory in a binary system of being not white, not male, or not heterosexual. We know that here in the Waikato, 90% of our wetlands have been drained since colonisation commenced. Combined with introduced predators and the impact on our Indigenous biodiversity has been catastrophic. Our kahikatea forests are diminishing, a combination of climate and the imperial legacy of dominating nature and environmental resources. We know that our transport systems were designed by men to get them to work in a direct way. The system was never evolved to include gendered caregiving responsibilities. The idea that a parent could take public transport to deliver a child to daycare, another to primary school and another to intermediate before going to some part-time work or their community volunteering roles, before going to the market and the supermarket, collecting all of those children and going home, is now just only being considered. That queer and trans people might not feel safe travelling alone on public transport is also new research, and it's another thing to consider in our work. The thing I want to talk most about is our food. Last year, we rescued and redistributed on average more than 9 tonnes of food each week, mostly in Kirikiriroa, with about a tonne in surrounding towns. Charitable food redistribution came with my ancestors from Europe. I remember my grandmother organising the church donations for the needy. Food banking is a growth sector in New Zealand. Food rescue is a colonial settler solution to the problem of overproduction, can never be an answer to food insecurity. Similarly, charitable redistribution of food is a colonial settler solution, again, imported with our middle-class great-great-grandmothers from Victorian England, who performed charitable acts to add to their character resume while waiting for a suitable marriage proposal. Modernising food banking by centralising in collection and distribution, creating rules around accessing rescued food, surplus items being donated by producers, and the bureaucracies imposed by government funders simply creates additional barriers to accessing surplus or waste food. Recently at Go Eco, we did an audit and we discovered that we rescued food from landfill, and it originated in Australia, Chile, Ecuador, Vietnam, Thailand, Sri Lanka, India, Italy, Netherlands, Singapore, and Switzerland. Food items that included tin spaghetti, cereal, gravy mix, spice, tin tomatoes, potato chips, cereal bars, sunflower oil, sauce, coffee beans, birdseed, coffee pods, and bananas. Everything except the bananas was wrapped in an environmentally lethal combination of plastic, aluminium, foil, or card. Sometimes a combination of all of those things constitute the wrapping to a piece of food. Abundant, healthy food systems do not produce environmentally lethal waste. Plastic, tin, and aluminium are not so easily recycled and still contribute to waste. Food sovereignty takes a closer look at the systems that produce food, who produces the food, and the environmental impact of that food production. This means for us that Indigenous and ancestral practices like foraging for puha and watercress, sharing fruit, veggies, seeds, seedlings with whānau and neighbours, or growing your own kai are all important in returning to systems which care for Papatūānuku and ourselves. So what we're starting to look at is indigenising food sovereignty and what it means. And we think it means moving to emphasise cultural responsibilities and relationships that Indigenous people have with their environment. It also requires supporting the efforts made by these communities to restore these relationships through the revitalisation of those Indigenous foods and that ecological knowledge systems and the broad well-being that comes with those. It also means that perhaps the biggest conversation still to come is the conversation about models of land ownership. Pre-colonial food economies made food available through trade, fed entire communities first, and traded the abundance. This model, or these models of food redistribution, reduce the need for tin tuna caught in our oceans, shipped to Thailand to be produced and smothered in environmentally lethal wrapping, shipped back, loaded onto trucks, transported around the country, and then sold at supermarkets before the excess is discarded to landfill. I want to also acknowledge India Logan Riley and what they said, which was get in line or get out of the way. We think that from a tangata tiriti perspective, this is our task. We have to learn about our impact and what we're doing while we provide, while we step out of the way, so that Maori, tangata whenua, hapu, can realise their kaitiakitanga, because by not being in the way, we're creating the space for that to happen. And on that note, one of the biggest learnings in this journey for us as tangata tiriti, while we we unpick these conversations and understand these systems of power is something that we learnt, which was around the doctrine of discovery. So again, going right back to our systems of power. And the learning from that being that first they discover, second they subjugate, and thirdly they fund. And that is the problematic environment that we're working in within the charitable sector, but also in the environmental sector. So, nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa. I'm handing back to Margaret.
Kia ora, Joe. You've just reminded me of a whole lot of things I learnt in my first year Maori and Indigenous Studies paper. Lots of parallel thinking, lots of parallel challenges of our way we look at the world as Pākehā, and realising that the way that we look at the world has really disadvantaged so many people, including tangata whenua. So, ka pai. I'd also like to thank all of our other speakers. A lot of us seem to have latched on to India Logan Riley, and I did as well. I think that quote of get in line or get out of the way, and I think it's just wonderful. And it reminded me of something Lorraine said yesterday on the podcast. Maybe it's time for the humble trees of the forest to lead the way. Maybe we need to say, well, our leaders, our biggest trees in the forest aren't doing the job we need. We need to do it ourselves. And for me, as a Pākehā, that means exactly like Joe said, making some space. I love the way that, Hamish, you brought in the personhood and the legal of the Whanganui River and the legality, and actually putting that into practice. That's a wonderful example for all of the world on how we can actually put these environmental controls into place for our shared future. And Kipper, you are quite right that science must have known that it was causing damage, and it's time for science to claim that, to see the privilege and to recognise the privilege that we have been sitting in, and to be part of the conversation of the solution. I mean, science has taught us a lot about our environment, and it will continue to do so, but it also has contributed to the problem. So completely agree with you there. So now there's a chance for each of our panelists just to respond to each other if they wish, and we'll just take it in turn. And so I'll stop talking and just invite Hamish if he wants to make some comments on what other people have said.
Oh, look, thank you very much, Margaret. Sorry about my internet connectivity. I dropped out for about 5 minutes there. I'm back for the moment. We'll see how it goes. Look, I was just completely inspired by the other speakers. And Joe, you're so right that just about everything we do is a challenge. Our thought processes are a challenge as tangata tiriti. So it's something that I'm willing to take up, pick up that whero and see where we get to. But I'm really glad you mentioned food and different ways of food resourcing, because just yesterday, I don't know if this will be in reverse, but regenerative local kai systems, a case for change, was discussed yesterday at a council meeting. And that's a simple practical thing that councils can make the decision now. We don't have to wait for select committees and legislation to pass. Councils right around the country can plant trees now, can deal with supporting regenerative local kai systems now. We can do this stuff now. And I think something I want to say about the big trees in the forest at COP26 is they're not thinking now. To have Narendra Modi saying 2070, when he'll be about 140 years old, when you've got Jair Bolsonaro, a hideous individual, talking about deforestation in 2030, well, that'll give him 9 years of, if he remains in power, to completely denude the Amazonas. So the sense of now, the sense of imperilment needs to be addressed, and councils can do that alongside, and it must be alongside, the community and tangata whenua.
Wonderful, thank you, Hamish. Kipper, would you like to?
Kawhai. Yeah, I've really enjoyed this session. The different perspectives all seem to be aligning on a common understanding. Water. Water is going to be our biggest issue. I think it's always been a really big deal for tangata whenua, for iwi Maori. We're starting to catch up with the Three Waters reforms. I think that's really going to create some change. I'm a little bit concerned that our territorial authorities are assuming the right to sit at the table. I think the issues of water ownership have not been resolved. And I think the people sitting at the table should sit at the table because of the expertise that they bring in terms of finding solutions. And I think from a territorial authority perspective, it may be an assumption that because people are elected to be in governance roles, that they are suitable to sit at that level of governance for the Three Waters. I'm not persuaded that that is automatically the case. I was really encouraged by what Hamish said. I think, sure, elected members need to be there to represent the voice of the people, but I think concurrently they also need to have the expertise to understand what the real issues are. Lorraine, I loved your kōrero. I would have loved to have said that too, and we didn't have time, so I'm really glad that you said it. Thank you very much. And Joe, food sovereignty. We've just launched our Te Arawa climate change strategy, Te Ara ki Kōpū, and food sovereignty was one of the three pillars, one of the main things. So I totally agree with what you've shared. So thank you, everybody. I'll pass on to Lorraine for her comments.
Sorry, Lorraine, can you unmute?
Always forgetting the button. I just wanted to congratulate everyone on their presentations. And I just want to make sure that everything that you said is what Waikato Tainui is thinking about, and it has it on our list. What we're wanting to invest in is the right investment moving forward with our marae and our people, and to get through the storm of climate change. And majority of the kōrero that this aligns to the kōrero that I was talking about yesterday, is that, you know, with the humble trees of the forest, and as our kingi Tāwhio alluded, that he didn't look at the big trees in the forest. He looked at the humble trees of the forest to fashion the house. And so, and the humble trees of the forest is us, the people. Yeah. But I think the gap in the climate change is climate change in health. And because once they realise the health consequence coming from climate change, will probably kick their butts into gear to make sure that things are going to happen. It's all blah blah, you know, nice words, lovely, we're going to do this and we're going to do that. And you hear that from the global leaders, but there's no action behind it. And people are getting, I think because it's the 26th time, COP26, I think people are just getting a bit annoyed hearing the same old with no evidence of action. And so for us as Maori, and I think for Indigenous peoples, we're getting annoyed. Yeah, and I think it's time, because this next decade is going to be very crucial, whether we're going to make it or not. And as I said yesterday, that rather than waiting for the tall trees of the forest to actually do something about it, we start doing something about it, the humble trees, us as humble trees. We are looking at lifeline legacies in Waikato Tainui, and we want to make sure that our marae are prepared. We have a plan B. We want our plan B, just in case things go to crap. Yeah, so we're looking at that plan, that investment. And I would suggest, if things are going the way it is for everyone to have a plan B in place, whatever that is for you. Kia ora.
Joe, would you like to add any comments now?
Kia ora. I do want to acknowledge and shout out and highly absolutely recommend people to read both the Waikato Tainui Environmental Plan and the Waikato Tainui Climate Plan. They are resources that we use in our work when we're making submissions, and they lay out a really clear vision and set of actions for what lies ahead. So I absolutely want to do that. And also more recently, the Te Arawa Climate Plan. Thank you for raising that, Dr. Kipper. We have been introduced to that through the Waikato Plan as well. And these are brilliant things. And I guess one of the things that frustrates me, and that this goes to what Lorraine was saying as well, is that lack of action. And people are like, we need a solution. And we go, look at these plans. Some people have done the work. And these plans are great, and they're there already. Why are we making another plan? And that is a constant source of frustration, I suppose, that we have to recreate plans, because the plan that the Indigenous people, that the kaitiaki of the rohi have developed is never quite, can never just be endorsed and accepted, which is a puzzle for tangata tiriti to work out in the future. And I think that feeds into that that ongoing frustration that we're at COP26, what's happening, who's doing what, and we need to acknowledge that there are people in Aroha and who are doing the thing every day at the moment to create change, and tautoko those efforts. So thank you all. I've really enjoyed listening to you today.
Thanks, Joe. And I think we'll wrap it up there. I feel like we all agree the direction we need to travel. And I feel like in Aotearoa, we are positioned really well to do this from the ground up, from the humble trees in the forest. So I just thank you very much, all panelists. It's been wonderful. Tēnā koutou katoa.
The University of Waikato is proud to introduce the world's first Bachelor of Climate Change for the people who know there is no Planet B. Gain the skills needed for the jobs of tomorrow. Contribute to a fundamental shift in the way we do business and go about our lives. Explore how Mataranga Maori can bring perspective to the most pressing issue of our time. Apply now and carve a career where passion and purpose collide.